Well, hello, and thank you all for tuning in to another panel. I am Sarah, and I work with the lovely Sam Rubenstein at Second Renaissance Arts. Today, we are going to be talking to two people discussing trauma theory in writing and this idea of writing about grief and its process. So, first, we have Miss Brittany Scardigno. She is a adjunct professor at both Monmouth University and Brookdale Community College. She holds an MA in literature from Monmouth University, and she is an expert on trauma and literature. And I cannot wait to have this discussion with her. It's been a long time coming. And so hey,
Hi.
thank you for being on our show here. This is going to be so much fun. I'm so excited to hear more about your thesis project and your viewpoint of trauma theory and this discussion in general. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Next, we have Ali. They are part of the community education. They are the community education coordinator at DSACC, the Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault Crisis Center of Warren County. And their former interpersonal violence counselor with a focus on increasing access to services and visibility of the LGBTQIA plus community in Warren County. Ali also works as a part-time outpatient therapist in New Jersey, mainly working with transgender and gender nonconforming clients of all ages and their families to navigate coming out, identity, development, and transition. Ali is a non-binary therapist, slam poet, performer, thrift haul enthusiast, and a longtime educator who believes visibility, creativity, cultural sensitivity and awareness, and empathy is a key to authentic and effective service provision and connection. So welcome, Ali. I cannot wait to sit down and talk to you. Your bio is so impressive. Really. And I'm sorry that I was stumbling because I have low light on my phone. So welcome, and thank you so much, both of you, for being a part of this. When I started Second Renaissance Arts, I've been wanting to do this panel for a long time because I, too, am a writer, and I've been working on my memoir that centers really around trauma and trauma theory and this idea of process through grief and the individualized journey of trauma. So this is so exciting, and I can't wait to start this. So, question for the two of you. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourselves, how you got into this field, this world, and what makes you so interested in it. So, Ali, why don't you go first?
Okay. I think I kind of started off my idea for a timeline about 2013. I studied abroad in college in Amsterdam and Morocco for a gender sexuality program. It was very niche, and at the end we had to do an individual research project, and I couldn't get approval from, it's something called the IRB, which I'm sure we're familiar with, but it's a panel that basically approves research. And I was trying to do it too late across the pond, and I should have known differently. So I had to scrap my entire idea originally for research, which was an oral history kind of collective project to, talk to queer people about their coming out story. And I just had to then do something similar because I had all the articles ready. So I basically came out myself and wrote a big piece about it. And I was taking dance classes while I was there to entertain myself. And I met a choreographer that had a similar trauma narrative as me, and we made a piece together. And then one of my classmates was a film major. So I filmed it and I just put it out there. And then I, included a lit review with it. So that was the first time I ever wrote a long poem that felt more like a piece than like just a diary entry or a journal. I think it's because I had just witnessed what slam poetry was at college right before I studied abroad. And I met a poet and like was falling in love. And like I was so interested in slam. It all kind of just wrapped together. And I'm like, I'm going to do this for my project. And there I was. So I definitely am more like monologue-y because I come from community theater from, many years ago, like childhood. So once I got back from Amsterdam, I kept going to open mics. That's when I started going to more slam events. And I started figuring out that it wasn't just a free-for-all. There was rules. It's a competition. It's timed. It's for points. It's much like serving your trauma on a platter for 3 minutes, like ripping your heart out and then putting it back in, which something was enticing about that as an actor, to have to block and stage and like get it out in a certain way. But it not being like the full story. So at the same time, I was studying psychology, and I was approaching senior year, and the cliche is you can't just be a psych bachelor's degree person for the rest of your life without something else. We kind of all figure that out. You either have to go into teaching or counseling or social work or something. So I knew I had to make a decision, and I already had connections at my alma mater at Montclair, and I just said, I'm going to stick around because I don't know what else to do. I thought like, oh, maybe the Peace Corps or this and that, maybe I'll travel again. And then those things didn't really pan out. So I enrolled in counseling with the intention of being in higher ed. And then I realized how admin heavy higher ed is, and it's not as much doing one-on-one therapy. And I was like, okay, I feel like there will be a time where I can do more education in therapy, but let me just try the counseling and stick with it. And I did. So I got accepted in the program, and I graduated in 2019. And, I never lost sight of my writing as a tool, or like slam as a tool, or what that community brought my attention to more readily. I guess that was kind of the forward movement. But if I also talk about when I got back from Amsterdam, I missed a part. I created a freshman writing seminar, like workshop series, as just a project. That's also how I, got my partner, like an ex-partner, to kind of work with me all the time. And it was like, our brainchild. And basically I just wanted people to sit down and write the story that had never been told in their life, and in a letter format to themselves. And we took that and then we paired them with somebody, like a mentor, who had an art form they could match it with. And then I got someone on campus who was in counseling to come in and, supervise, just for safety reasons. And by the end, we had a performance night of about, I think, 5 people, including me, that shared some type of art form that initially started out as a letter to themselves. And we had like an audience of 100 or 150 people. And we just had like an open, like, dialogue and interactive, like, sharing portion. And it was really cool. And that's when I knew like group therapy was something I wanted to do someday, or like art programming that's therapeutic like that. So I took that and I ran with it. And yeah, 2019, I graduated. When you're going for your license, you have to wait a few months basically for the board to approve. And sometimes it's more than a few months. It depends if you're lucky. So I was waiting around, and I was just on Indeed all the time. And I found this job in Warren County, New Jersey. I was like, what even is that? I know pretty much everywhere in New Jersey. And I was like, I've never even heard of here. So I said, this is too good to be true. It was like for LGBTQ counselor, and I went for it. And at first it was only supposed to be part-time because it's all grant funded positions at my nonprofit. And then somehow magically came through and they got me full-time. And that was like the day I started was the day I got my license approved, and it all just panned out for me. But of course, March 2020 wasn't too far away, and there was a lot of stress in between with some of the things we were taking care of in the community. And we went from fully operational to all remote services with domestic violence and sexual assault survivors within 48 hours. And again, I'm a brand new therapist. I've barely had a lot of supervision. I've barely had a lot of experience except internship. We do have to do 700 hours of internship in our program. Like, it's not like you're not experienced at all, but You're new. And it was a lot. It was very stressful. When you think of this community, you think, a lot of people don't have access to computers or cell phones because they don't have money if they're being financially abused. Everybody was forced in the house together. So if you were under the same roof as your abuser, and you couldn't leave and there was no access to leaving, you couldn't meet with me necessarily quietly or like talk on the phone. I couldn't see people's faces anymore like I was when they were coming in person. I was talking on the phone, doing phone counseling, which I'm still uncertain what that's supposed to look like. But it's on the computer, but I can barely hear them and the internet's cutting in and out. And it was just so much to try to figure out how to do it and barriers to work through. And then I didn't realize tonight was really centered around grief. So I'm just speaking about trauma generally, but I can speak to, grief more specifically. I lost 4 people to COVID or cancer in 2020 myself.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. It was almost like one after the other, pretty much like the matriarchs of my family. And then my favorite high school teacher passed away, who was the person who really inspired me so many years ago to come out and study gender and take it seriously and study psychology and go my own way. So that one really hit me hard. And it was a year to the day of when I got my license and I got the job offer, or my first day. So I was struggling at the same time with grieving and how to take time off effectively when I was stuck in the house and I couldn't really go out and do things. And my parents live in Florida now, they're retired, and trying to visit and flights or driving and no vaccines yet. It was wild, wild west, none of us knew how to do it. Going to Zoom funerals, Zoom Shiva, Zoom bat mitzvah, and I was on the computer all the time, right? All of us were just glued to these AirPods and that computer, exhausted, sleepless, headache, dehydrated, back hurting, just sitting all day, tired. By November of 2020, I was kind of personally just shut down a little bit. I felt like I couldn't give the same crisis support and intervention to those survivors. I felt like I needed to step back, and I asked for that, and my job was very supportive and helpful. And I, still wanted to work toward licensure, but I didn't know how. So I went out on a whim and applied for outpatient group practices, and I got a job within 3 days. I was like, okay, I'm going to make the jump and see how it goes. And it's almost a year to the day of working part-time there. I can't believe it's been a year. And I pretty much manifested it because in Warren County, I'm sure people in this call may understand, it's a much more rural part of New Jersey. It's bordering PA. So there's still a lot of, using my words carefully, it's quite conservative overall, and it's not as open-minded. So to try to find people, queer people, to come out and come forward as queer and to work on those issues and counseling on top of just fleeing an abusive relationship was almost impossible. I only had a very small amount of people I saw in that year. So my goal was, I want to work with the LGBTQ community no matter what. That's my specialty. That's what I've always done. That's what I can offer. So I kind of manifested that in this outpatient. And I've been seeing a lot of trans folks, non-binary folks, people questioning ever since. And I'm actually connected now with, it's called the Babs Sipperstein Proud Center, which is in Somerset area, Somerville. And it's an all-in-one care process for getting HRT, getting evals for top surgery, for gender confirmation surgery, for support groups for you and for partners. And it's only a few years old, but we take referrals from them constantly. We give referrals back, and we work together as a unit. And it's so cool. I always wanted to be in connection with that. Because years ago, when I first understood what, working with trans folks was, there was only the, forgive me, it's in New York City, and it's escaping me right now. There's only one center that is very famous in New York, and then there's the Mazzoni Center, which is in Philly. And everybody from New Jersey that was trans, that wanted hormones, had to go one way or the other. And people in New Jersey were frustrated for many years. So RWJ created the center, and now we're here. And yeah, I've been doing that for about a year. And through all of this, I've had lots of opportunities to, still do poetry. That's how I got reconnected with Sam. So we've had virtual open mics for months. It's been like 2 years, but we're starting to come back in person for open mics. We're starting to do some slams again. And, more and more people have been grieving over the last 2 years, or reckoning with more of their own identity or their personal, things in just a direct way, and not like wrapping it up in a poem or wrapping it up in artwork. A lot of us, I think, as artists, were completely stunted for months when the pandemic hit, like had no creative juices at all, which is accurate, and it's like human, it's right, I think, in terms of development. Like nobody knew what to do. So it just took a while to get into a groove of people coming back to their artistic, senses. And I think in that, people were looking at me more as like, oh, you're a therapist and not just a poet. And I've been able to do more panels like this, or talks, or like lectures or workshops, or bring that into these spaces, which
the weaving of it both. Yeah.
Yes. Which I always speak about. And that's what my poetry kind of shows, but it's, you get to talk through it, and not just, okay, it's 2 minutes and 50 seconds and then it's over. So I feel like this is the most intersectional like experience I've had, and that's all I preach is intersectionality, but actually doing it is amazing. And now I'm here, and hopefully there's more to come with, opportunities and how to integrate into my practice, or meeting, other professors or artists. And it's not over, the pandemic's not over, but I think the way we're approaching how we talk about our mental health and our grief and our trauma definitely is for the better now.
Absolutely. And I am so excited to have you, and thank you so much for being here. And I wrote so many questions down, so
Cool. Let's go.
So be ready. Okay, so Brittany, what brings you here? Brittany and I, we used to go to Mama together. Now that she's a big time professor, and I'm still a graduate student, we're still, at Monmouth, but she's, now has a big girl job. So Brittany, tell us a little bit about your project that you worked on, and why you gravitated towards it, and who you are.
So I just want to start out by saying, Ali, judging from everything that you've said, I think your approach for intersectionality is such a success, and you don't even realize it. Like from where you started to where you are now, like not only having the scriptural element of trauma narratives, but having the visual element to it with the artistic visual aspect of it, and how that kind of transformed into your job now. And you are bringing that to your job, and you're bringing your job with you into your own art. And I see it. You're doing it.
Oh, thank you. That's so affirming.
I just want to start out with that, just like from listening. So, me personally, hi everybody. I'm Brittany. I am currently, as Sarah said, I'm an adjunct professor at Monmouth U and Brookdale Community College, which are both in Monmouth County, New Jersey. So how I first originally started with the subject of trauma in general did not begin as trauma or anything to do with trauma theory at all. And it's always really inspirational to listen to creative writers, because I'm not a creative writer, I'm a research writer, like I'm defined as a theorist rather than a creative writer. I don't see myself as a writer. I see it more as like a researcher. So it's always really cool to hear the creative writing aspect of it, and it just kind of goes hand in hand with it. So when I first began with this subject, I had no idea it was even going to turn into something that had to do with trauma, because I was mostly focused and interested and invested in the idea of silence in literature in general. And it started out with the idea of when silence is a good thing and when silence is a bad thing for someone's healing. And I had originally wrote a little baby paper, I think it was my junior year of undergrad, that dealt with when silence was good and how silence can help us heal. And that kind of just snowballed. My teacher at the time had mentioned to me, she's like, hey, if you're ever thinking about going to grad school, this could potentially become a thesis. Like, this could become something. And I feel like a thesis is something that you never get to be without after you write it. It's my child as well as my 2 dogs, which I have one on my lap because he has anxiety just like me. So he's laying down. He's
dog.
Show us the dog.
Yeah.
Hello. Hello.
He needs a haircut. So
We all do. I think it happened.
Yeah, I know.
This week.
So that idea kind of stuck with me, and lo and behold, I found myself in grad school, and that thought kind of just stuck with me throughout the rest of my school career, of this idea of silence and how was I really going to go about it, because I was like, well, what's the so what point about this? So I started toying with the idea, and I was like, well, I already kind of looked into how silence is beneficial for someone's healing, but I think there's a lot more to be said when silence is detrimental towards someone's healing, or when silence is regressive towards someone's healing, and what makes silence good and what makes silence bad. I became more focused on when silence is bad. And these were just ideas I was kind of toying around with until one day I was talking to my advisor over at Monmouth. His name is Dr. Anwar Uhuru. He is an expert in African diaspora and also gender and sexuality studies as well. And he was just listening to me one day, and he's like, have you ever considered looking more into trauma theory? And I was like, what's that? Like, I had no idea. And it opened up this whole other realm of possibility for this study that I had no idea even existed. And I was telling Sarah earlier too, how it's really shocking to think about it now that I was not exposed to trauma theory until my second year of grad school. It's a very late period in someone's school experience or their school career to be exposed to something like that, when it is very relevant and it's very current and it's an immediate issue, right? So I ended up looking more into it and I got hooked. So ever since then, I mean, writing the thesis and everything, like I said, just opened up this whole window of opportunity that I didn't even know existed. And the main challenge of anything when you're writing a thesis is you have to contribute something new to the conversation. And it's like that daunting question, what do I have to say that is new to hundreds of years of research already done? But trauma theory itself is still relatively very new, maybe within the past, 70 years or so, because it derived from psychoanalytic theory. So when we think about psychoanalytic theory, for people who are watching who may not be familiar with it, it's when the reader, uncover the unconscious desires or unconscious thoughts, wants of the author as a reader. And how to dissect that. When a writer is writing something or creating something that they're not even conscious that they're putting out there. And like Ali was saying before, when you're putting out something like trauma, that's a whole nother ballpark. So when you're writing a trauma narrative, which I recently have been exposed to graphic trauma narratives, which I think is such a cool idea. Again, having that visual element, it's more, it's pictures and not real life action. like a video where there's no movement, but to have pictures associated with the trauma narrative is really interesting too. So I do plan on doing a little bit of that once I get my hands on this graphic trauma narrative called Viet in America, by a first-generation Vietnamese author whose parents were born in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. So that's something I'm looking to get more into. But when it all came boiled down to was my view on trauma theory became focused on basically 3 ideas for when silence is regressive towards someone's ability to heal from a traumatic event or a series of traumatic events. And that kind of came down to the 3 areas of the role of the listener. The role of the listener can either be progressive or regressive toward the one expressing or narrating their trauma. The role of the storyteller, the person who is in charge of dictating their own trauma, being silent on their own terms versus being silent or being forced to be silent. Makes a huge difference. If you are being silent for protection, if you are being silent because of fear, or if you're being silent because of immediate danger, if you were to break that silence, there's immediate physical or emotional consequences that come along with it. Or if you're staying silent on your own terms, you have now agency over your own silence. So the practice of agency comes into it too. And the last section, which is a huge conversation, probably for a different day, but it's the idea of bio and necropolitics. So I'll give you a very quick snapshot of that very quickly. Biopolitics is the idea of when a sovereign power dictates a certain population's or a certain demographic's quality of life, or a sovereign power dictates how one gets to live. Whereas necropolitics, which feeds into our conversation more tonight, because I focus a bit more on necropolitics in the study, necropolitics is when a sovereign power dictates a certain population's or a certain demographic's ability to mourn, ability to grieve, when a sovereign power now has dictation over how someone is allowed to grieve over a loss, whether it's of something physical, of a human body, but the mourning process and the ability to complete the mourning process has a lot to do with it. So that's where I'm at now. Now I'm teaching first year composition, and I'm a new teacher. I don't know what I'm doing, but hey, I'm having fun, and my kids are great. I think they're awesome, and they're super smart, and it's been a wild ride, and I don't know how I ended up here, but I'm glad I did.
Well, I'm glad you're here.
Yeah.
So I'm getting some feedback. Yeah, everybody good? Hi, Sam.
Oh, you're muted, Sam.
So the feedback is on your end. You have a video
Hold
of
on.
someone in the background.
I haven't moved. Hold on. Pause. Just bear with me.
I didn't think she was going to
I
leave.
have so many. I wrote down so many things too. I have so many ideas.
This has been like one of the most like intense but interesting conversations for me, who has a very weird background in the world of psychology, because like Ali, I actually worked as a therapist, did my master's in child psychology, but went in a very different route, working with behavioral need students and behavioral need people. And so like hearing this whole other world of grief and processing and understanding trauma is really interesting to me, and I've been having a great time sitting in the background. So thank you both so much for being here.
I'm back. Sorry.
And
Are
we
we
can
good?
hear you. Yeah.
Okay, good. I had to put headphones on. Sorry. All right, so let's kind of dive into talking about process. I know, Ali, you said that you've kind of ventured into this world of slam poetry where I too was a poet first. And I was writing about trauma on that end of the world, writing about unrequited horrible love poems, and then the trauma after that. But then now I'm working on a memoir focused around my father's passing and this idea of dealing with the trauma of a lost parent, but not really going through like doing it as a poetry. And so I'm curious what your process is when kind of separating your work life and then also integrating that into your own creative work. And Brittany too, I know that you don't do creative stuff, but how do you integrate like your research on trauma maybe into your own trauma? So Ali, why don't you go first?
Well, first I want to send condolences and comfort to you for
Thank
the
you.
passing of your father, or, you know, I wish you that this process is helpful to your healing and however
Thank
that
you.
looks. There's so much to say. I think when I look back at really my whole life, there's other things I didn't share. I ventured into therapy for the very first time when I was 15, 16 years old, and it was suggested as a healing process of my own to lead a group of similarly, you know, not traumatized, but let me back up. At least the same age of people. Like I recruited people that were like me in my high school for a support group, and I actually did it. And I wasn't allowed to hold it in school because of the politics of talking about spirituality and like self-growth and healing. And I had to go through the church, which was complicated. I had just become a church member, but that's how I found out what social work was. I got a godmother out of it. It like connected to the community. It turned into we can't do it at the church, it's at the library. That's when I first felt like I'm going to be in this world, like even before everything else I said already. And I did like lesson plans, and I would read a book and come up with a lesson plan, and it was creative, and it just kept going. But that was the first time that I dealt with the experience of what we call transference and countertransference in therapy, which was my own story was becoming known to me because it was repressed for so long when other people were sitting across the table and sharing theirs. And I had no idea how to self-care or handle that. And I had to look at, you know, this older woman who's a social worker who, you know, is now my godparent. And like, we had lots of deep conversations, and I would go back to therapy. Like, what is any of this? Is this what your intention was? Like, this is wild. And from there, you know, I became more aware of my memories. I became more aware of my trauma. I was writing more in a more specific way as well, like not as poetic yet, just more, it just needed to get out because it hadn't been out. Whereas maybe when I was younger, it was more like songs and it was creative, and then it turned into more clear. And I took that and I kind of was bouncing for years between this, like a clear-cut trauma narrative that had very heavy detail and was the names and was very specific, versus the creative part of liking extended metaphor and liking, you know, rhyming scheme or, you know, flow and to perform it. I was always back and forth between the two. I'm also a dancer, and I feel like I'm naturally more present and attached to myself when I move it out than when I write it and say it. So that's just something to keep in mind.
That's interesting. Really interesting.
Mm-hmm. So I appreciate, Brittany, you picking up on that, because I didn't speak much to it, but I felt I can usually visualize a poem or a piece first before the whole piece of the narrative is done. Like I can think of the first line of a poem and the last and what I would stage it as, and then the rest follows it in between. And I usually can picture what my body will do, or my inflection or my tone, or where I'll look as it's happening. And I'm sure if there are certain friends on the call that are poets as well, everyone has a different way of writing poetry and getting ready for memorizing poems and performing them, I have to write the piece as soon as it comes. As soon, like generally within that day, it all comes out and I barely edit it. Like I just go. I don't really workshop. I don't write every day. I can't do it that way. It's a full visual concept piece and it comes out and then I perform it and then I see how it goes. I see reaction to it and then I kind of edit it from there, whether I go to an open mic the next time and I get all the time I want to do it at my pace, or it's a slam and then I have to cut it a little bit or take this part out or censor it depending on the audience, aka if your parents are there or like something like that, right? So that's how my pieces then change over time. Just like I guess an actor could come to set and do a line 10 different ways and they pick the best cut for the movie. Or maybe a therapy client, you see the same person and they share the same story, but a new piece comes out every single time as you keep talking about it. It's all kind of similar. I'm very interested in talking about silence with you, Brittany, because that's a huge learning curve for new counselors and social workers. Like you're taught to practice it and it's so uncomfortable because as humans, I think we naturally want to fill silence. But the concept of it being either healing or more regressive, that's the art of it, because therapy is art. You have to learn when is the right time to be silent and for how long, and with who it makes more sense, or forcing people that don't like it to do it. Like it's a very back and forth dance. And you could sit in silence for like almost a whole session. If someone's mandated to see you as a client and like you have to see them, they know. So sometimes you have a full session of just silence and it's all body language and it's all eyes and it's all feeling, which is really interesting. And I was going to say to you, Brittany, I think you would really be interested in learning what trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is, because the trauma narrative is actually one of the first steps in the process. It's done with people that are as young as 2 or 3 years old up to 18 years old. And Rowan University is like the main research department that created it, that created the therapy and trains for it in New Jersey. I was enrolled in the collaborative at my job when I was in counseling before I switched my roles, and I was starting to meet with kiddos, but it was right at the end when I was about to kind of transition out. So I chose to remove myself from the collab, but it's either visual, it's drawing, it's or speaking, or it's writing, or letters, or reading books. And that's how a child formulates the narrative. And then at the end of the therapy modality, about 12 weeks or so, depending on the nature of the trauma, they make their own book of their story. And then you get to sit with the parent or the caregiver or the adult, whoever it is, whoever's involved, and you read it together for exposure therapy. So it's really amazing. I was thinking of that when you were talking. So yeah, I didn't understand, like I understood what the theory was about it before I even got to the place where I was in grad school actually learning theory. Like I knew that I sort of figured it out instinctually how it goes to unravel trauma, but it wasn't until probably my second year of grad school, and I have the book with me. I've had it ever since. It's called The Neuroscience of Human Relationships, Cozzolino. And I learned about polyvagal theory, which is also called social engagement system, or neuroplasticity. And I actually wrote a poem. As soon as I learned what the vagus nerve was, I like had a poem concept, and I was like, because it means wander. And just so much came to my mind. So I've learned over time as I've gone along that our bodies, cliche, like our bodies keep the score. That's like the number one therapist book, but they really do. Like everything's housed in our nervous system, and it takes time, and it takes saying it, and it takes reading it, it takes hearing all your 5 senses to engage with different levels of trauma, for it to kind of be fleshed out. And I think the goal ultimately for me is for people to be more healthily, stably, and securely attached to themselves, so they can do the same in their relationships and with others again, if they've gone through mostly interpersonal trauma. That's what I've worked the most with so far, of all levels. grief is complicated. It's a little different, I think. I think of grief, yes, literally, if a loss of a person or an animal or something, but the grief that I've worked with a lot stems from, I think, people's grieving their past self or their childhood self, or the loss of like a romantic partnership from abuse, or like the complicated nature of never feeling securely attached and like not knowing when they're going to be in a relationship or their authentic self. So I think of it more like, broadly like that. And I think if you look into polyvagal theory and neuroplasticity, meaning the brain is forced to adapt and change for the better over time with each new trauma that occurs, it's really more of a person-centered approach, and it actually is a strength-based approach. Whereas a lot of practitioners, and I don't just mean practitioners, maybe researchers, come from the more like deficit place. Whereas counselors, I feel like, and social workers try to come from the grassroots, bottom-up, strength-based approach. And I feel like, I don't know if I'm onto something, Brittany, or with you here, but I feel like silence cuts the middle of that, either bottom up or top down. So like researchers are probably top down, like, and they get to a root eventually once they research enough. And then counselors get all of it right up front on a platter, and it's bottom up. And I feel like silence probably is a common denominator, or like it crosses and cuts through the middle. So I'm really interested to hear more about what you've come to with coming to understand silence, because it's a tool and it's an art, and it's a hard thing to master in relationship.
I'm so
I
excited
don't know if
to hear
that
about it
answered your
too.
question, but I just
No,
I had to
it
say
did.
Yeah, the whole time.
No, it absolutely did answer the question, and I too am excited to hear more about this idea of silence. Brittany and I have talked about it while she was writing it, and then when I was telling her about my project, she's like, "Oh my God! Like all the things that I wrote about in my thesis, you're doing it," and I was just like, "Wow,
so validating. That's cool.
like that's cool." I'm like, "You are." She's like, "You're doing it," and I was like, "Oh, good." So. So Brittany, kind of tell me like how do you integrate your own trauma or your personal traumas into your research? And then also please go into the silence thing, because I'm in. I'm into it.
Okay. So as for the research, I feel like, we talked about this a little bit earlier too, Sarah, with what we even define as trauma anymore, and how that has changed within the past even 2 years. It's just so relevant still. And it's been going on forever. It's just been kept more silent longer ago than it is now, obviously. Mm-hmm. But for my own research, I guess it really just depends on how someone defines their own personal trauma to begin with, because something that I wanted to definitely research more into was what types of trauma is there? What constitutes a trauma? And I found myself, and I had to check my own ignorance when I was doing this research big time, because I focused on two trauma narratives for the thesis. For the research, I focused on two trauma narratives. And neither of them are actually formally genred out as a trauma narrative. It's just I defined them and I defended them as trauma narratives, even though they're not constituted as a trauma narrative formally, like in print, or may not even be acknowledged by the authors themselves as a trauma narrative. So the first book I worked with was actually a sequel to Albert Camus' The Stranger. It's called The Meursault Investigation by a French-Algerian author named Kamel Daoud. And basically, if anyone's not familiar with Camus' The Stranger, long story short, a French guy, is in colonized French Algiers. He's completely amoral. He has no morals, close to no emotion. And that's a whole thing in itself. But long story short, give a quick snapshot of The Stranger, as easy as that can only be. So this guy's main character, Merceau, his mother dies. He feels no emotion. So after his mother dies, he goes on a trip to the beach with some of his friends. And earlier in that day, as they're on their way to the beach, across the street from him, him and his friends see a group of native Algerian men on the opposite side of the street of them, and they exchange a stare. There's no verbal exchange. It's just a silent stare. And Merceau, the protagonist, takes their stare as a threat. He takes it as a threat to his own and his friends' safety immediately, because they're different, right? They're the other. And it really visualizes that with being on opposite sides of the street within a nation that is colonized by the French, where the Algerians are natives. So there's a lot of violence going on, the Battle of Algiers, all of that. So with the historical context too, it comes into a lot. So basically, they go to the beach. After he has this stare exchange with the Algerian across the street, they go to the beach, and Merceau is walking on the beach. He happens to have a pistol. He happens to have a gun on him, and he finds the Algerian man that he had the silent exchange with. He finds him lying underneath a shady tree under a rock. Like, he's laying in the shade. He's laying there. And Merceau sees, he's like, the sun was in my eyes. The main characters in The Stranger, for Camus' The Stranger, he is extremely sensitive to light, sound, taste. He has very heightened senses. So the sun is in his eyes. He tastes the salt from the sea. He gets way too overwhelmed from his senses, and he sees the Algerian man laying there in the shade start to reach for a knife. So Merceau then proceeds to shoot the Algerian man a total of, I believe it's 5 times. It might be 8 times, actually. It's either 5 or 8 times. I can't remember which. So he shoots the Algerian man. He goes to court for the murder of this Algerian man, but during the court hearing, there is not a single word of the murder mentioned. There is no testimony from the Algerian perspective, the Arab man's family. We get no word on the murder in the trial whatsoever, because the trial ends up becoming obsessed, and the jury becomes obsessed with the idea that this man, Merceau, did not cry at his mother's funeral. And that is what they choose to focus on instead of the murder, for which is why he's actually there. So long story short, Merceau gets the death penalty. I'm sorry, I just ruined the end of the book for you if anyone hasn't read it, but he gets the death penalty. So the sequel, the Merceau investigation, is a response to that, and it is written from that murdered Arab's brother's point of view. And I also want to point out in Camus' The Stranger, the words the Arab appear in The Stranger 28 times. His name is never spoken. He never gets a name. So in this sequel, the Merceau investigation, his brother now has his turn to give his testimony and to give his brother back his name, which it's Musa. And his brother's name is Haroun. So Haroun, the murdered Arab's brother, is narrating the trauma that he has gone through his entire life and more specifically after his brother gets murdered by a French man. And his life is not acknowledged because the court and the justice system didn't acknowledge it, especially during the period of colonization with French Algiers. So certain lives were considered unimportant or just not being worth documented. Certain court hearings were never recorded because violence between the two ethnicities was so common that they thought it pointless to record anything. They stopped recording numbers of deaths. They stopped recording a whole bunch of things during the Battle of Algiers. And even though this is a fictional story, it is the substance of it is very, very real. So that's the first book that I discuss. And in that book, since I take it, the substance of it is so real and so nonfiction because it actually most likely could have happened. And it talks about a legitimate historical period in time. The trauma in that narrative was very tangible. You can see the trauma, you can pinpoint the times and the events that triggered the traumatic events for Musa's brother, Harun, who is telling the story. And you can also sense in the story when he begins to revert back to his silence. Because the whole point of the book is he spent 70 years, as Ali was saying before, silence can last an entire session. For this narrator, silence lasted 70 years before he found a progressive listener for his brother's legacy. So the trauma in that book is very tangible, and it's easier to identify and pinpoint exactly where this trauma is. And after reading that book, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is obviously a trauma narrative. The second book, it didn't come so easily, which kind of forced me to go deeper into the research process and kind of investigate, how do we identify trauma when we cannot pinpoint a traumatic event or pinpoint a series of traumatic events. So the second book, which was a lot more difficult, is a memoir written by a first-generation Chinese woman. Her name is Maxine Hong Kingston, and her memoir is titled Woman Warrior, A Girlhood Among Ghosts. And with that memoir, I was struggling because I had to check my own ignorance with this research process, and I think that's like one of the most important things that witnessing trauma and someone who wants to become a progressive listener to someone else's trauma has to practice. You have to check your own ignorance first in order to be able to bear witness to somebody else's. And I was getting frustrated because I was like, where's the trauma in this? I'm like, this is a very traumatic story, but there is not a single thing in here that fit my definition of trauma at that time. So, and all of a sudden one day I had this huge light come upon me and I was like, oh my God, it's because the trauma is intangible. In this memoir, you can't see it, you can't pinpoint it, you can't touch it, smell it, feel it. It's not there because it's intangible, because it's emotional, because it's inside. It is trauma that you cannot see. It is trauma that has never been voiced before. And she was still not in her memoir voicing that as trauma. But I finally recognized it as, okay, this is like first generational trauma, but it's intangible. Whereas the Merceau investigation, the trauma is very tangible. And you can pinpoint exactly, like, oh yeah, that's definitely traumatic. But with Kingston's memoir, it was definitely a reality check in how I view personal traumatic experiences and then other people's traumatic experiences as well. Because, I was so desperate because it's like, how when someone is struggling and they're feeling some type of way and they're frustrated because they don't know how they feel, they don't know why they feel this way, because trauma also affects someone's memory, which Ali, I'm sure you can speak a lot to as well. When people block out traumatic events, and in the process of writing, you're revisiting and reliving those traumatic events, and that really takes a toll on somebody. And when you are, which is why like creative writing and trauma narratives really speak to me, because I think that's one of the most difficult and most noble and brave things someone can do, is put those experiences out into the public when it is so private. But in order for anything to become progressive with someone's healing, it kind of has to become public to an extent. As long as the one who is expressing or giving voice to that trauma has agency who they are telling it to. Versus when the difference between a personal journal diary entry and publishing a public memoir or trauma narrative to market value that you could sell to anybody, then you can't control who your audience is. So that always led me to my research as well, that whole idea of how readers are responding or witnessing another person's trauma narrative. So that kind of segued into like the role of the listener, like how are we as readers witnessing or listening to these trauma narratives? And maybe we can relate them to our own trauma. But I think that's a very sensitive issue when the author themselves does not define it as trauma, and then some random person like me comes along as like, it's trauma. So the research process has just been such a rabbit hole, but I love it. And it's led me to some really groundbreaking ideas that I wouldn't have thought otherwise if I didn't come up with these research questions, and just from own personal interest, because that's what I tell my students a lot. You have to research something that you're actually really interested in. And something that has always personally interested in me is, I'm a huge Samuel Beckett fan, as Sarah knows. Like, I love existentialism. I love thinking and asking questions about death. It's just fascinating because it's unknown. And it's one of the biggest human conscious fears that we have as human beings. So it's worth a conversation.
I think as you were speaking, I just wrote down what we call it in counseling, or I guess what social workers learn, is active listening. So I keep hearing you come back, Brittany, to progressive versus regressive, and all I can visualize is a spectrum or an arrow. And I think of and teach everything in terms of spectrums and continuums. But active to me, like anyone can do, regardless of what you think the end goal is or not, because it's the skills of paraphrasing, summarizing, nonverbal, verbal. Like that's what you're supposed to do regardless, because everyone thinks like go to a therapist to get advice. No, you're not supposed to get advice. Like it's supposed to be as we call it now, like a safe container. You're supposed to be a container for the person in the room. And that could mean you're actively listening, even if the person is more or less silent, or there's gaps between a memory and another memory, or putting together a memory. And if you're actively listening, you're going to almost be like in a transcendental, like meditative state with the person. It might be that feeling of you look up and like, oh God, the session's already over. Like maybe you feel like it needs to go on. And I think that I'm interested to like hear if you've heard of that term, Brittany, like, or if Sarah, if you've come across like active, because it's what we say the most. And in terms with trauma, I think the only other thing I wrote down that I wondered if that's what you came to, or both of you looking in trauma theory, is we call it big T versus little t. And it's more or less of a paradigm and a binary. So I'm trying to get out of it myself, but that's what you first are taught. Big T is like going through a natural disaster, like, Sandy or Katrina, or, being a prisoner of war, or being on active duty at one point and witnessing a death, in the line of duty, finding someone when they're dead, like that's all, like, witnessing domestic violence, big T, right? Little t is more or less the neglect, emotional neglect, or your father, when you were born, like, was already in jail, and that was just an absent figure, right? Like, it's more or less passive, but that's it. To call it passive versus active, it diminishes the experience or the way someone could come to understand their own trauma if it's not big. And that's what, coming into the domestic violence and sexual violence field, that's where a supervisor first confronted me. Like, you shouldn't keep necessarily saying big T, little t to everyone you're working with. Like, just consider that sometimes little is the biggest thing ever for some people, and sometimes big is nothing at all, depending on race, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic stat, like every, identity across the board makes for a different experience of trauma for people. So these are some paradigms and, like, dichotomies that I kept hearing you get back to, Brittany. And I'm wondering, like, I keep thinking of the thing that I've learned that might cut the middle. Are these phrases, I suppose.
Well, Brittany, why don't you answer your question? Why don't you answer the question? And then we have a question from our audience too. So, do you want to talk about the big T, little t, and all that, or do you want to go on to the question?
I'll answer really quick, and then we can go to Lillian's question, because that's towards Ali. So,
I'll try.
So when you say active listening, that's exactly what I'm discussing with progressive listening or progressive listener. I never once came across active listening in my research because I wanted to kind of purposely shy away from the psychology and psychiatrist point of view from it, because I'm not familiar with that field. So, and I'm like a super noob with that field. But it's such an important piece to it. But with progressive listeners, the way I defined it was more a progressive listener will allow extended amounts of silence and allows the narrator or allows the person who's giving their testimony of trauma, it allows them to tell it as long as they want, how they want, and when they want. If you want to talk to me, if you don't want to talk to me right now, talk to me when you're ready. Talk to me in 5 years when you think you have gained enough time to mentally prepare yourself and how you want to express this story, because it is your story. Whereas like regressive listening, I guess that might fit more in with the passive, because with the regressive listening, it's more so you're listening, you are listening, but it's not, you're either forcing someone, well, no, I guess it's not the same as passive listening then. Because like the way I kind of saw regressive listening was you are either forcing someone to give a testimony before they're ready to, or you are forcibly restricting someone's testimony of trauma before they're ready to. So you're either forcing them to speak or you're forcing them to stop speaking. So that really complicates a lot of things. But with the big T and the little t too, Sarah and I had a very brief discussion on this earlier as well. The little t, as you were saying, Ali, is just as important because I guess it has been perpetuated for so long that it is little. And when we hear the word little, it means not as important, not as immediate, or not as, I guess, detrimental. Whereas the emotional side of it, even though it's intangible, it is still very much there. It is still real. And because those issues haven't been directed attention for so long, and now they finally starting to gain a little, movement behind them, I think people are getting a bit more comfortable to recognize those little T's as
absolutely
trauma itself,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was just going to jump in with you because, Brittany, we had this discussion earlier today about, like, because she's helping me with my thesis, and I was like, when does trauma, like, trauma has become sort of like a trend, and like when does it become devalued, and is this, are the little T's becoming big T's now because more it's becoming more marketable, and is that does the trauma of that little T become less valued because it is marketable now, like the Me Too movement and things like that?
That's
Is
what I was
that
thinking.
becoming less as private and intimate of your own trauma because it is now everybody's coming out and saying this? But we'll go back to that. I want to talk about that, but I also want to go back to Lillian's question. How does I think this is more directed towards you, Ali. How does one
I want to open the
navigate?
chat, but I don't want to leave the meeting. I'm trying to I have nails. I'm trying to tap on them to make sure I don't leave. Okay, wait, hold on.
You're still here.
Okay, got it. I can see the question. Okay, got it.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So, just for people who can't see the question, I'll just read it aloud. How does one navigate trauma-informed interviews with people, specifically LGBTQ plus, when tackling instances of trauma? That's a fabulous question. Thank you, Lillian.
It is. Thank you. Okay, so I think this goes into everything we've said so far. We're kind of figuring out what trauma even means. Like when a person comes forward and first submits like a contact form, for outpatient therapy, for instance, if they're not if they're not coming from a higher level of care and forced basically to have a follow-up appointment, like that's a referral process that I could talk to that agency or hospital or whatever it is and kind of know what's happened. If it's just someone on their own volition filling out a presenting issue, some people might open up all the doors and share a lot, and then a lot of people, more I think so, don't really share a ton. They share one specific thing that they probably think will be able to be navigated, right? And then usually once you get to intake time, there's lots going on. There's a long history. There's lots of things that were left unsaid, or there were no answers given on the whole form, and then the story changes. That's what I found, at least so far, working in outpatient. But it's different now for me versus when I was just an intern in grad school, because you're just trying to get your hours. So anyone that kind of comes through, you're kind of taking. Whereas now I'm marketing myself on a website as, with my pronouns, my identity, what I'm specializing in, what I'm looking to work with. So I'm getting those referrals, and I'm working with people from the jump. So they can put in their contact form or on their call or their email, what they're looking to process in therapy. However, someone saying, I'm looking to transition and start HRT, not necessarily saying what the trauma that, in their life is attached to that. That's just what they're, coming to you with. And then when you get into the intake or talking to them, intakes usually are called biopsychosocial assessments. That's how most people structure an intake, unless it's you work at an outpatient that also deals with co-occurring disorders or people that struggle with substance use as well. That's more style what we call motivational interviewing, which is a whole format of how to do an intake. But most of the time it's biopsychosocial, which is also a theory. So biological, health, what's your physical health history, your medical health, your family gene, situation, you do a family tree maybe, or we call a genogram, we talk about family mental health history, physical health, socioeconomic status, all the things that you were born into. Psycho is your own mental health, not psycho, but the psycho part of it, right? The word. Have you been hospitalized before? How long have you been in therapy? If you've ever been, have you taken any medication? Coping skills, et cetera, et cetera. And then social. So do you have friends? Do you have support? Do you have hobbies? What's your environment like? What have been the big changes in your life recently? What are the changes you want to see? And it's a whole macro and micro combination of looking at a person. And by that point, usually when you ask all these questions, you still might not get a ton of answers because it's the first hour of meeting a stranger and you're a stranger to this person. then as time goes on, I think you start to unravel and unravel and unravel based on what the person is saying. So from that point of view, I think everyone should be a trauma-informed person or practitioner from the start. And if you're not hearing like something that maybe is leaning on the precipice of that sounds like that's a wound, or that seems like they're getting to something that's raw, you have to be a clinical judger, like use that clinical judgment and that instinct as a practitioner to be like, okay, is this a person that I can like ask a follow-up question and like poke at that a little, or how are they responding? Which that's when the nonverbals come in. You look at their affect, you look at their mood, you look at their speech, their pace, are they rocking their body? Are they fidgeting? Are they biting their nail? Like you look at the whole picture and you judge in an hour. Can I, leave that, or do I touch that, or how long? And that's where silence comes in too, right? You don't want to be completely silent for a whole hour with somebody. Like you need, the intake is probably the most a therapist should talk to, like to summarize what the person is saying, to make sure they understand, to paraphrase, to ask the really the most closed-ended questions, which is like, have you ever thought about killing yourself before? If you're talking about suicidal ideation, like very specific and clear questioning, right? Once it moves along, and if you're asking more specifically, Lillian, I'm getting there, about LGBTQ folks, gender and sexuality conversation is more of like a historical recapturing, like going back to first memories and kind of talking about you're coming into your own identity, that usually then for most people I have found involves some type of trauma, emotional, physical, sexual, something. There typically is something along the way. And if there's not, at least with like some kiddos that I've worked with so far, it's usually the parents bringing in their kid after they've come out to them, and the parents are, I'm just being honest, maybe it's a problem or it's a phase. It's still a lot of how people are approaching things. And then it becomes more like the parents are more of the we call identified client. And then the child is kind of just along for the ride. And then I end up talking to the kiddos about their favorite anime or manga or like whatever they want for like 30 minutes. And then the parents like need a lot more coaching or resource sharing, or their own, what's your trauma history? What was your family like? What are your, like, and then it starts to unravel. It can turn into family therapy at that point. That's for kiddos. For adults, I'm thinking of one case that I've had within the last 2 years that really sticks out. It took months to get to the point where I understood the person I was talking to had a history of financial abuse from their own guardian. And until we unlocked that part of the story and that key, like, we couldn't really move forward. Like, we could talk all we wanted about getting into a new psychiatrist's office, or like medication or HRT or transition, or like moving out, getting a new job. We could talk about all of that, but all of a sudden it was, my caregiver has manipulated and like used me for money my whole life. And I also don't have a relationship with my other caregiver. And I'm like, oh my God, like, if anyone knows, it's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you go by that theory, like the baseline of security and stability was never there for this person. And it's a pyramid. So you can't stack these blocks of the rest of the pyramid all the way to self-efficacy and enlightenment if you don't have food, shelter, rent paid, like all the bottom stuff. Like, you're stacking Jenga like the wrong way. You're not like doing Jenga basically the right, like in a good way. And I just had to slow the person down at that point and be like, it's okay that we don't sit here and like pound like into gender identity like every single time, when you're worried about where your bills are, what your bills are up to, like what your food is going to be, like what your diet is. Like, you're allowed as a whole person to just be there, and like, let's talk about that. That's fine. And then as we did that, then it moved into, okay, now I'm like taking steps toward that. I'm getting that rectified. I'm standing up for myself there. Then the confidence boost came. Then the mood improved. then the a plan, and we were able to make for goals, like longer term goals. That's what I think trauma informed is, if I'm honest. Looking at a holistic person and not compartmentalizing somebody into parts, not saying the presenting issue is gender, so we can only talk about gender and nothing else. Like, no, you're a human being that needs to be alive. And that's where we need to start. And whatever that need is, that's what I want to get to. They may be resistant to it. I think resistance is great. I love working through resistance, right? Like, that's where the good stuff is. That's where the change is. And usually the clients that you are going over and over in your head after session for a whole week, or you keep bringing up to your supervisor, you keep thinking of different ways to approach, that's usually the person that's like, something's going on that connects to you the most. So that's usually when you have to do your own work, talk to your own supervisor about your trauma history or your stuff, or go to your therapist and kind of work through it, being confidential. So trauma informed to me is not breaking up a person into pieces or silos. It's understanding that intersectionality of how every element of their history, of their life, has balled itself together into like a rubber band ball. And you are a person that's helping them take one piece of the rubber band off at a time until you get to like a manageable ball that you can kind of hold and look at and like, okay, I can deal with this now. It's a little more manageable. Don't know if that was the specific answer, but I'm a therapist, so it usually never is a clear specific answer.
Well, that blew me away. So that blew me away as a person. So thank you. I was like, wow.
A lot. People are a lot, right? People are multifaceted.
People are a lot.
So that's what it is.
Yeah. So we have time for a couple more questions. I have one specifically for Brittany, and then Ali, I think maybe you could probably jump in on this too, because I'm in the creative aspect of it. Brittany and I were talking about earlier today about what makes something traumatic. And Brittany, I wanted to kind of focus this more question on to you. When you were doing your research and you were looking at trauma theory and literature, like what constituted it as traumatic? Now that because there's so many definitions for trauma. In your research, what did you find to be that answer?
So what I found to be that answer, I'll be kind of quick because Lillian has another question. What I found the answer was in a very recent trauma theorist named Eden Wells Friedman, her book, Reading Testimony, Witnessing Trauma. It's a very good theoretical book that helps explain trauma theory a bit further, and she mostly focuses on African-American trauma theory and things like that for marginalized populations in America. But I loved her definition of what trauma theory is in her eyes, because she builds off of the very classic trauma theorists, such as like Kathy Carruth. She's like the most infamous trauma theorist there is. She's pretty much the one who branded trauma theory. Kathy Carruth is the one who established the framework for trauma theory, like building it off of psychoanalytic theory and things like that. But how Friedman defines trauma theory is pretty damn close to what Ali was saying before. She defines trauma theory as not only what is psychically shattering, but also the socioeconomic background. Have you survived natural disasters? Who do you associate yourself with? What demographic are you from? Where are your parents from? Where were you born? Were you born on a border? That all kind of constitutes and goes into what an individual can define as trauma, because it pretty much incorporates everything in that you have experienced as an individual in your own personal life. And therefore you get to relate it to what you see other people are going through as well, which is super convenient nowadays because we have endless information at our fingertips. which of course is a good and a bad thing, you know? I mean, along with endless information at our fingertips through our phones, it also comes with an endless list of fears as well. Like there was a research project done, because I have a very brief, short experience with Homeland Security and domestic and international terrorism. There was a very big study done on right post 9/11. People in California actually formed PTSD from 9/11 from watching the video footage over and over and over. And because it was so ingrained into the TVs and everywhere you looked, it was, these are the buildings crashing down, America's under attack. People in California on the complete opposite side of the country formed PTSD from 9/11, which is really wild to think about, because we're right here on, you know, we're right on the East Coast. We're an hour away from New York City. You know, like my family was in the city at the time. They couldn't come home for like a week and a half. It was impossible to get out. And just watching real life footage from those types of events, those types of disasters, whether they're natural or humanly created through war, you know, experiencing it first person and experiencing it from a screen can now be considered the same kind of thing. And it's really wild to think about that. And that has just completely transformed what trauma is, and what Ali was saying before, to actually define trauma. I don't think there's a definite pinpoint answer for it right now. I don't know if there ever will be, because it's evolving so much, just along with how other words change their meaning over time, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you ask somebody what trauma is maybe 20 years ago, it'd be different than if you were asking someone today. And
well, it's like individual and collective. That's like a theme that I keep hearing, like, and that's a big one that everyone can kind of go back to. Like, we started this conversation talking, maybe your big question, Sarah, like, was like, how do you integrate your own trauma, which is coming from like that individual place. But then, you know, Brittany's research for sure, like, tackles collective, because it's collective experience, more so collective experience. Like, it's one story as a piece of literature, but like, it's talking about race, you know, and racial trauma. It's talking about gun violence as trauma. It's talking about, you know, borders and travel, and like
Your
all of
geographic
that could be then attacked.
can be trauma.
right.
Right. Which a lot of people can relate to. And I think that's why PTSD can, you know, be so widespread. Like, it can come from just witnessing something that everybody could have experienced, like a human collective experience. This is why I think most people, once we knew what coronavirus was, went back in time to look at how the HIV and AIDS epidemic was handled. And that's new research that's going to keep coming out over the next few years in terms of trauma, like witnessing death over and over again, but then it's still happening and not knowing when it's ending, and not knowing if it's going to happen to you or someone you know, but we still have to keep doing life anyway. That's exactly what HIV and AIDS was like, you know, for everyone involved and touched by it, and it's, you know, repeating itself, right? I think that's hard. It's like, because we all have grief, but yeah, it looks so different across the board, or trauma looks so different. In terms of, I kind of want to attach Lillian's question so we keep on time.
Yeah, and thank you, Lillian, for submitting the questions. They're fabulous.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ali. Sorry.
I think, oh, thank God it popped up again, because I didn't want to touch the screen and exit out with my nails. So, okay, so now I can read it.
Thanks, Sam.
I think, well, first off, let me say, I think everyone that's on TikTok or Instagram follows at least one Instagram therapist or someone that knows something about trauma theory and being trauma informed at this point. 13-year-olds are coming out with like far more knowledge to me right now about trauma and like understanding their own mental health than ever before. It's also no surprise why the most people have come out in the last 2 years than ever before, being in a pandemic and isolated and being able to be with their own thoughts so many revelations psychologically have happened over the last 2 years. When I first wanted to, when I was studying abroad, that was my project. I wanted to do oral history collection of people's coming out narrative. And I was just going to start off with one question of tell me your coming out story and let them go. And if I think, Brittany, like you probably have touched oral history a little bit, so you can, just chime in and cut me off, speak to it too. But with the way I learned how to conduct an oral history interview was that person gets unlimited time. It's one question. It's unstructured. They get to say whatever they want for as long as they feel they need to talk. And then you stop the record button when they feel complete. That's a good consensual question just to ask anybody at like various times of like, do you feel complete? Like, what else could we speak about that or something. That's where it started. And that's why I think counseling is so appealing to me. It's just, there are things like health insurance and billing that are parameters to doing the work. So everyone that comes in the doors, maybe not Lillian with you, because now that I've worked in a nonprofit and a DV place myself, we didn't take health insurance because we're nonprofit and it's free. It's crisis center. I didn't have to diagnose anybody. I had to think about it when counseling with them, but I didn't have to put it on paper. I didn't have to submit billing. Like none of that had to be done. So there was really no pressure, like in terms of, it was just sit them down, safety plan, resources, get the main issue, and then try to work with them as best you can while keeping in mind what they could be going through mentally. Now that I'm an outpatient and there's insurance involved, I have to create a diagnosis quickly. I have to assess in that structured way, not as much unstructured like oral history, which I love. I have to ask all these questions to get a diagnosis and to make a treatment plan within like 3 sessions or something. And yeah, the presenting issue could drastically change from the first session to that third. And then I still have to make a diagnosis and a treatment plan. And then put the cherry on top, insurance, sometimes certain plans don't accept certain diagnoses. So I could know that I'm working with someone that wants to transition and their insurance doesn't accept gender dysphoria as a diagnosis. Then what do I do? And then I have to change it. And then I have to like tell them about it, the client. And then I have to figure out how to like serve them and help them and get them to where they need to be. So in my heart, it's like, if I just had unlimited time, I would just let someone go. Like it would just go and go and go. This is why there's a social activist push, I think, in the mental health world right now for peer-led everything. Get rid of the barriers, get rid of health insurance, get rid of therapists that are not, with lived experience as yours or with the same identity as you. Find a place to squat. I don't know if people are squatting, but like I'm thinking back to Amsterdam, people would just squat and like create, a commune basically and live together and help each other, mutual aid, right? And then there's peer support spaces. And it's really coming from the helm of a lot of people that are on the autism spectrum are really frustrated that they can't get assessments, can't get diagnosed, but they know that they experience these things and they want someone to validate them and talk to them that understands. People are just finding community and making groups on Zoom and like doing their thing, and they're getting a workbook and there they go. Who's to say what's helpful for some people and what's not, right? I think just therapists and social workers are tapped into access of certain resources. So it can be helpful, but you can't assume that, you're going to be the only source of help, like, or the longest, timeline of help for somebody. Think of it always as more of a stepping stone. And then even if, you end up having to walk away from therapy for your own personal reasons, or the client is scared and abandons the process and like leaves, which happens a lot. It was all meant for something. It all was supposed to get to that place for whatever reason, right? And whether or not they understand it 5 years later or like however soon or than 5, or I understand what it was about, that's where I think you kind of have to keep oral history in mind along the way, that you're going to get whatever amount of the story that is supposed to come out when it does, because repressed memory is real. Memory loss is real with trauma. narrative formation is disjointed, and you just have to keep with it that it happened the way it was supposed to happen, and you did the best you could, for everybody, right? So I again don't know if that's an exact answer. I think short though, everyone that talks to somebody about something so personal should take a training or a course of some level or read something about trauma-informed care. I just don't think it's ethical or moral entirely to like have somebody open up like that without you having some foundation of trauma-informed care to stand on. Like, I would say go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and make sure that's always in your mind of like, if somebody is doing an oral history interview with them, making sure that that place you're doing it at has water bottles, snacks, Visa gift cards if you can get some, if people need a bus ride home or to go to a store and get something after, they shared all this with you, and like make sure they're good. Like they gave you something you were looking for, right? Take care of their basic needs. Check in with them if you're allowed to in between interviews. Have them write down things, give them hotlines, crisis lines to call in between interviews. That's trauma informed. It's filling in those in between moments, right? When it's not the full wound, like excision, you're giving them stuff to stitch themselves back up in between. That's what I would say. I think the trauma informed approach would look like in what you're doing or what you're asking about.
Right on.
Wow. I'm blown away. So we're just reaching the end of time, but I want to thank you both so much. This conversation was beautiful and for me personally life-changing. And I really would love to do a part 2 of this. So maybe we'll
for sure.
coordinate something and we'll figure that out. But thank you all for joining in, and thank you to our panelists. And where can we find you if anybody has any follow-up questions? Ali, I know you said you had an email. Can we post it, or can we send it directly to put on our site?
I think what I would like, we were joking earlier about emails. I'm that person that like never deletes email. Like you don't want to know how many emails I have in my email. If you get like questions, maybe if Sarah or Sam get questions like directed at me, just message me, let me know, and then I'll figure out the right way to get in contact with them. Just because I'm not taking any new clients right now at work, so I don't want to give out my work email, and I don't want an emergency email to come through when I'm not checking it. So, and then my personal is kind of a mess. So yeah, just let me know if there's any questions, and then I'll get an answer.
Absolutely. And Brittany, where can we find you?
I have Instagram. That's pretty much the extent of my communication. It's like Ali was saying, professional emails are constantly chiming on my phone, so I get enough of the emails too. Yeah, I have my Instagram. If you find yourself in Monmouth County at one of the colleges, if you're at Monmouth U or if you're at Brookdale, let me know. We can chat.
All right, great. Well, if anybody has any questions, you can just feel free to email myself or Sam. My email is sarahvivica@secondren.com. Or you can even leave a comment on the Facebook, on our Facebook, YouTube, or even Instagram. You can send us a message on there, and we can relay the questions to you. So thank you all for coming, and thank you again to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hold on.